Hello, welcome to Ollie's Garage. Today we have a Deutz 5506 in the garage and we will be replacing the clutch on it. So the clutch is going out on this tractor, and the way I can tell is that the clutch, when I'm releasing it, it grabs way too quickly and it's very jerky. So I'm assuming the friction material in there is gone. The procedure is fairly straightforward and you don't need that much more than normal hand tools, but you definitely also need to have two different ways to jack up the tractor for when we split it apart. This procedure is going to be very similar for all the 06 style Deutz tractors, as well as the few 07s that are out there, and then also all of your DX tractors. Now, of course, the larger the tractor gets and the more stuff it has on it, the more you have to take off, but in general, the principle is going to be very similar for all of these models. Stay tuned. Looking at the tractor right here, as you can see, this is the engine right here, and then right here is where the engine and the transmission come together, and we have to split it right here. So this is a very basic model. It doesn't have anything else on it. It did have a loader on it that we took off. There's still a little bit left of this loader. But aside from that, now we just have to disconnect everything so that we can split it. Looking on this side right here, the main things that we have are going to be this fuel line that runs to the tank. Then we also have this lever right here that we have to disconnect. Aside from that, we have one more piece right here that we have to disconnect. And then all of the screws holding the two halves together are on this transmission side. So you can see them right there and then down around the bottom as well. On this side, it's slightly more complicated. You have this steering bar right here that we'll have to disconnect. You also have the screws, and then we also have the whole wiring harness that I'm probably just gonna connect from up here, and then so that we can split the two halves. There are also two hydraulic lines that we'll also have to disconnect, but it's not gonna be too difficult. I'm gonna start by disconnecting these levers. So they just have these little pins in there on both of them. So we'll straighten those out. I always like to put these things back once you took them out so that you don't forget where they go. And also, take a lot of pictures. Close the tank. We'll disconnect the cable for the lights, and then we'll pull the hood off. We have one wire in here that we'll disconnect, and this diesel return line as well. The cylinder head temperature sensor right here. Take that wire off. Again, nuts go right back on. Now we have to disconnect all these wires, and I'm just going to disconnect them from all the components here. Again, make sure you take pictures. I have a video going, so that always helps. We're going to disconnect the battery, of course, before we play with the electrics. Quick little note when you are cracking this nut loose. Always use a wrench to hold the inside here, and then crack it loose. If you don't hold it, you will crack this plastic right here, and then you need a new starter, and that's very expensive. Always, always, always hold it first and then crack it loose. This heater plug right here, and then this little wire. Now we have to get the tachometer cable right here. It's already loose. This goes into the engine, so we don't want to get any dirt in here. Crack this loose. We have to disconnect the steering piece. For this, we're using a ball joint separator. These work pretty well. Here we have two hydraulic lines, this big one, the small one. The small one we're gonna undo there, and then undo right in there, and then the big one Just gonna crack loose right there. Remember, hydraulic systems don't like dirt, so clean it off really nicely. And then let's crack it loose. Time to crack this one loose.
Comes.
Yeah. Remove the starter here, at least this bolt. Here I have this jack so that we can roll it backwards, and this jack is supporting the rear half. So we want to jack it up just a little bit, just till it starts to lift it up just ever so slightly. Right there is probably good. And then we'll jack the car jack up as well. Just ein bisschen. This leicht up. All right, we just saw the front end start to come up, so that's good. Now we just have the bolts right around here that we need to loosen. We'll go pretty quick. Okay, with all the bolts out, I already saw a little bit of a crack forming right here. So I jacked it up just a little bit to get that crack to close. And now we can split the two halves. Now we need to keep an eye on this gap. Nur ganz wenig. Das ist wahrscheinlich gut. Okay, and now we get to read the tractor as we're undoing it here. I got a little bit ahead of myself, but you can pull this shaft straight out. So this is an input shaft for the transmission. You can just pull that one straight out. Be careful not to ding this portion right here. This is where the pilot bearing in your engine rides. So we want to make sure that we keep it in good shape. And then to take this clutch and flywheel off, there are a bunch of these bolts right here that go in all of these holes. You can just unscrew those. Then you carefully pull off this whole clutch and pressure plate system. There is a PTO disc in here as well. Here you can see the other side of this pressure plate. This is the PTO disc in here as well, and in there that's the drive disc. Set this all aside. Here we're at the flywheel. I already took this off once, but there's 10 of these bolts in here that you can just undo. And once you've undone them, this sucker's kind of heavy. Then you just need to wiggle it off. It's on here pretty tight, so just wiggle it with some screwdrivers and keep wiggling. Be careful though so you don't knock off the tractor from your blocks. And then just lift it off. Here you can see this is the rear crank of the engine, so this is that rear main seal. It's been leaking, so we'll replace that. And then in here you can see this is also, there's been some leaking going on. So we're gonna clean all this out, and then we're gonna start replacing some seals. We're also gonna pull all this out to get some new bearings as well. This is your throwout bearing. As you can see, when you push the clutch, it moves right there. All these springs. We're gonna take this out, replace those roll pins. These sometimes fail. I've had them fail on a tractor before. But we'll get to work cleaning first. The next thing that we want to do is we want to pull this whole thing out. And there's another bearing back here that I also want to replace. To do that, it's pretty straightforward. We have to knock out these 2 roll pins, and then we just pull this shaft out and then undo these 3 screws. I'm gonna have to remove the rest of this so I can remove the steering gear to free up some space down there. You'll see why here in a second. So basically what we're gonna do is just pull the steering wheel, take out these screws right here. There's also a couple small ones down here. And we're just gonna start pulling all this off. Don't forget to disconnect your tank sender here. Got 1 wire loose, just wiggle the second off. We got the 2 screws out over there that you just saw. Now we just need to pull this one out, and then we need to pull that one over there out, and then we can remove this whole piece. Then the gas tank comes out, then the steering column comes out. Just keep on lifting up. It's coming off. I was trying to avoid it, but we are draining the fuel tank. Since we need to remove it, I want to make it light. This tank is held on by 1 13mm bolt right in here, so we're going to remove that now. All right, now the tank should be free. There's a little clip down here that holds some wires, so we're just going to bend that down a little bit. Pull these wires out. I need to take off this big hydraulic line. Let's crack it loose. Just losing a little bit of fluid, but that's no problem. We'll plug that hole so that we don't get any dirt going into it. Now we get to crack this one loose, then we can remove that whole line. Yeah. Time to continue to remove this whole steering thing. We're just gonna crack these all loose. There's also 1 13mm right on the backside here that just holds some of this electronic stuff up. Another hydraulic line, let's do that one. So 1 line right here, I cracked it loose. We're gonna remove it real quick. That one should be loose now. Let's lift it on out. This thing's gonna be heavy. Okay, there we have it. Now we can remove this plastic piece and continue driving out that roll pin. There we go. And if you look closely, that's the roll pin. So we just need to finish driving it on out, pull out that shaft. Okay, let's finish up this job. Now it can spin freely. All right, now we can just pull it straight on out. There we go. If you have a clutch where the PTO is a separate lever, then you'll have to disconnect that from down here. There'll just be a little nut as well, then you can drop that out. But since now basically everything is free, we just need to remove these 3 screws and then we'll pull this whole thing out. Then you want to support the shaft on the inside. And we've got it all out. As you can see right in there, that's that bearing. We want to replace that as well. Some people might not want to replace this bearing, but listen, it needs it. If you're going to do the clutch and get this far, do every single bearing and gasket that you can get to. That includes this one, that includes your throwout bearing, of course, and also the pilot bearing on the engine. This pilot bearing is terrible. It needs to be replaced badly. There's actually one really classic way to remove these, and that is with bread. So what you do is you just take some bread, shove it in there until it's full, then you hammer in something that's just a little smaller than the pilot bearing's hole, and then you keep pushing in bread and hammering it in. Well, I don't have any bread, but one of my mechanic buddies told me if you use paper towels and some grease, that also works. And I'm in the barn right now, so I don't have any bread laying around. So let's try it with some paper towels and some grease. There we have it. Nice and shoved full of, paper towel and grease. But this is out. Now we can measure it and get a new one. Now we just have to carefully pry all these paper towels out. I think the bread would have been quicker, but this worked pretty well. Thanks, Carlson. We also will be replacing this rear main seal while we're in here. This is definitely one that you just want to replace while you're already in here repairing things. Otherwise it can leak onto your clutch and that ruins all the work you just did. You might have to crack it loose with a rubber mallet, but this one came off very well. We have to now remove this rear main seal here, and we're just going to do this with a punch and a hammer. Now we need to clean off this seal residue, and you can just do that with a really new razor blade. Don't scratch the aluminum. With this piece all nice and clean, we can now press in our new rear main seal. I'm just going to grease it up a little bit here. I have some penetrating oil. And now I'm just going to grab a nice flat piece of wood. We want to make sure that it pretty much touches all aspects of the seal as best as we can. Let's press it in. There we go. I now have to pull off this bearing. To do that, I'm going to first take off these two springs so I can just work with this green piece alone. This definitely needed replaced. We've got everything in here lubricated really nicely. Now it is time to press in this bearing. Okay, so that's slid in with a lot of press action. Let's just make sure it's seated all the way. We want to make sure that we have something that's just pressing on that outside race like this. We also grease this up nicely. Now we're going to press on this bearing. It goes on like this. We're going to use this piece that just presses on the outside. Much better. Make sure to fill this groove in there with grease and grease everything in here really well. With everything greased up, we can now slide it back on. And now we just have to put the springs back on. I cleaned this out really nicely. Now we're just going to put a little bit of oil in it. Oil the new bearing. We're going to press it on in. Just go until it seats. I cleaned this all with some degreaser. Now it's time to put on a little bit of this gasket maker. I have a layer of grease right in here in that sealing surface for the rear main seal. This is also nice and clean. Now let's slide it on. Carefully slide that gasket over. We don't want to damage it. We're gonna snug these bottom 3 up first just a little bit. This is going into aluminum. We don't want to over tighten these. And now we're gonna tighten these up, just go diagonally. Just snug them for now and then we'll torque them. We will torque this to 28 Newton meters. These are going to be 20 Newton meters because they go into aluminum. This surface is clean and the back of the flywheel is clean, so now let's mount it. You've got the dowel here, so just make sure to line that up with your flywheel. That's where the dowel needs to go. There you go. Here you can see that dowel right in there. Now let's put these screws back in. We're just gonna put a dab of this medium thread locker on these bolts. 35 Newton meters, make sure we go diagonally. This is how I'm holding this so it doesn't spin. I just put a bolt in, put a little wrench into that hole. That holds it perfectly as I tighten all the bolts. Now we need to turn each of these 45 degrees twice, again diagonally. This is the input shaft. I greased it, but I wiped almost all the grease out of these grooves. We just want a little bit in there because that'll keep everything in this clutch disc nice and greased so that these splines don't rust out. You always want to put just a tiny amount of grease. I also greased this portion to go into the pilot bearing, and then I greased this back portion which goes into the transmission. I scuffed this up with some sanding paper just to get it a little bit rough again, and now we're gonna wipe off any grease with some brake clean. Now we have the clutch disc here. We want to take this side that's thicker here, and this needs to be facing outwards, so we can just put that in right there. Now we take our clutch, and we want to put these 3 things with these cutouts in the flywheel. Okay. Now we're going to try to just get 1 screw started. And let's do another one on this side. In here you can see the inner clutch disc is way low. So we have to center it now. And the best way to center that is just by using the input shaft. Now it goes in that pilot bearing. Now I also want to make sure that this input shaft is relatively centered. So right about there, now we can start tightening down some of our screws. $30 Newton meters. And then we want to finish putting a thin coat of grease on these. Just like that. Now we have to take the shaft and put it in this bearing. The shaft just a tiny amount loose on this bearing so I don't have to press it. If you do have to press it, you can just press against this orange thing. But there we are. And now we can slide this piece already in here. Time for these 3 bolts. I have a little bit of thread locker on them. 30 Newton meters. I've already greased these here, and these tabs where they go back here. So we can just slide this piece on. Now we can take the shaft, slide it on in. It needs to be in this orientation, right like this. This clutch shaft needs to be in the orientation about like this, where it's standing straight up. And it's time to put in new roll pins. Make sure you always use new ones. These things can break if they get old. All right, that's all good there. Just gonna clean off a couple of the sawdust stuff here, but this side is now complete. We're gonna put this input shaft in. I greased the splines and the pilot bearing area. Now we're gonna scoot these two halves together. If you get really long threaded rods, that makes it sometimes easier from just here, because then you can match it up. I don't have those today, so we're just gonna do our best. Also make sure that you grease these 3 little contact areas and also that throwout bearing in there. I already had everything greased, so it's time to push it together. These screws, we just put them in to help guide everything together. As you can see, there's still a ton of room between that head before it's squeezing the tractor together. Do not squeeze the tractor together with the screws. You'll ruin a lot of components if you do that. This is just to help us guide it, because now the entire thing is oriented correctly. Now you're gonna see us try to wiggle it back together again some more now that everything's in a closer orientation. This is now a tractor that has been slid back together. Now we take these bolts out, put the right length ones in, and pull it all nice and tight. We'll do that one at a time. Even though this lip in here is holding it, I just want to do one of these at a time to make sure that everything's still nice and secure. And now we torque the bolts, get the jacks out of there, but that's how you do it. These are nice little guiding features that we then use to slide it all together. The torque for these bolts that connect the engine and the transmission is 40 Newton meters. At this point with the tractor, made it again. Let's start connecting all these hydraulic hoses in the steering column. Then I'm gonna take it and wash everything down. Then we're gonna do the final assembly of the last bits like the tank and the electronics. All of these hydraulic lines I just snugged down a little bit. I also made sure that they're not rubbing. Here they got close, so I put a zip tie around it. Same thing in here. Snugged up the hydraulic lines, made sure that they're not rubbing in here. Now it's time to put the fuel tank back on, and then we will be connecting all of the wiring back to the starter and running it up front. One thing that you also want to do is always use a little bit of dielectric silicone grease when you put your wires back on the starter bolts. You'll see me doing that in the time lapse as well. And when you tighten this nut, you need to do the same thing. You need to hold it with the wrench first, and then use a second wrench to tighten it. Otherwise, again, you can risk breaking that plastic on the starter, and then you need a new starter. Okay, here we have our clutch mechanism. I greased all of this right here, and we can slide it into the pedal, just like that. Spread out a little bit of grease. Take the washer, put that in place. Now's your time to grease everything, so make sure that you really grease this mechanism well, because you're probably not gonna do it again for a long time. Now we want to adjust this mechanism here so that we only have 28 millimeters of play until we start to feel the clutch start to grab. We continued adjusting the clutch a little bit, and now, till it starts to get really hard to push right there, that needs to be 28 millimeters. We're just a little bit above that. We're sitting right at about 32 or so. That's all the adjustment I can get out of this adjuster right now, which that's okay. We'll have to see how that works. I'll show you what this is doing underneath when I squeeze on it real quick. Okay, here we are underneath the tractor. This thing right there is a throwout bearing. These are our clutch levers. And watch, when I push on this clutch, that's that 28 millimeters of free play. You don't want that throwout bearing always pushing on those clutch fingers. It'll induce a lot of wear. So that's the adjustment that we made. Now I'm gonna tighten down that bolt, put on my lower cover, and we should be good to go. At the back of the tractor here, I already opened it. This is where you fill up the hydraulic fluid, so we gotta fill it up with 10W30. Let's check the oil level. All right, that looks good. Still on the bottom portion of the dipstick, but it's definitely on there. It's good enough for now. Check the oil level real quick. Looks good.
Okay, versuchen wir es. Ja.